Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa is in Saudi Arabia tonight on a state visit. He was forced to postpone the initial trip there in April after floods in KwaZulu-Natal, which claimed the lives of hundreds of people and displaced thousands. Ramaphosa's first visit to Saudi Arabia as head of state was in 2018. He and his counterpart are expected to discuss various issues, including the Africa Continental free trade and export market opportunities both countries are looking at the moment. Let's talk about this with Thembisa, Fakude, the director at the Africa-Asia Dialogue Organization, with us in studio, fortunately, tonight. A very good evening to you. Thank you for your time and patience. So how important is the visit to Saudi Arabia for South Africa, given everything that's going on in the world at the moment?
Well, it's important because Saudi Arabia, as you know, is expanding. There's an expansion of the population of Saudi Arabia. And they need goods and services, particularly fresh produce. So if you look at the composition of the delegation that the President is taking with him, suggests, of course, that South Africa is going there to try and cement those relationships, and hopefully South Africa will benefit from Saudi Arabia's economy that continues to demand and look for better opportunities, particularly when it comes to fresh produce from Africa.
You mentioned fresh produce. One of the conversations which will be awkward when it comes up will probably have to do with the Transnet strike at the moment. We're unable to move things through our ports, and the South African delegation, I'd imagine, will try to convince the Saudis that this is not going to be a common occurrence going forward.
Well, fortunately, most of the goods that come from South Africa into the Gulf is all flown in, because it will take forever to get the fresh produce, if you really think about it. So when it comes to the Transnet strike, it's relevant because it is going to impact on the relationship moving forward between South Africa and Saudi Arabia. But the larger part of export business from South Africa to Saudi Arabia is using air cargo to get goods into Saudi Arabia.
Part of the delegation is also the Transport Minister, Fakude. There'll be a lot of conversations we're expecting around infrastructure. What can the Saudis do to help?
Yeah, well, whereas most of the economic cluster ministers who have joined the President, Fakude is there to learn, I would like to believe, because I'm not quite sure whether he's going to teach Saudis anything new, given that we have managed somehow to run down our railway system, etc. So I think Fakude is an exception in that delegation, is there to see how best he can come back with certain skills to implement back at home, because Saudis have done very well when it comes to their public transportation. So we hope that Fakude will come back and implement whatever it is that we'll learn from that.
And earlier I was looking at an article where President Ramaphosa was saying he's hopeful that the $5 billion worth of investment could be increased. Is that something that would happen in one instance, I wonder, given the hesitation for many countries that are now inward-looking, both post-COVID, not even post-COVID, but given the end of the lockdowns and the ongoing economic turmoil in the country and globally?
Well, Saudi Arabia is looking at expanding, but importantly is also looking at diversification in terms of the economy. Right now, their mainstay economy is the gas and oil, and that is, as you know, facing certain difficulties, particularly oil, given the Paris Accord. So Saudi Arabia is looking at diversification and diversifying the economy, and South Africa is ready to do business. And I think Saudis will find those kind of opportunities ready and available in this country.
You mentioned oil. The U.S. President just this week, Joe Biden, was very upset and threatened some form of consequences for Saudi Arabia because Saudi, along with the other OPEC oil-producing countries, have now decided, somewhat controversially, to cut down production. Now that President Ramaphosa is there, do you think there may be an awkward position where South Africa basically has to decide if we're closer to Riyadh or Washington? Or can we be able to walk that middle ground?
Well, I was scolded earlier on when I suggested that President Cyril Ramaphosa would likely to whisper a message from Joe Biden regarding the cut of production, because that's what's going to happen. What OPEC did certainly did annoy the Americans. Joe Biden went to an extent of saying there will be consequences. And we know the relationship that Joe Biden enjoys with President Cyril Ramaphosa. So it's likely, more likely, that President Cyril Ramaphosa will whisper a message from President Biden, but not only from President Biden, from people of Africa. We are going to be impacted by the cut of production of oil, because that's going to impact on our prices as well, and the energy prices. So President Cyril Ramaphosa will have a responsibility, first as an African president, but importantly also as the close ally of President Joe Biden.
And just on that issue, I mean, we've spoken about the economic potential of this trip, right? But there's also, at the moment, advances being made by different parts of Europe, the Americans as well. You look at Russia making advances in terms of influence in Africa, in places such as Burkina Faso, where there's just been the second coup this year. Is the Middle East, is the Gulf, a country like Saudi Arabia, for instance, interested in that level of influence?
Yes, they are, but Russia, of course, Russia is not directly involved, but it's using all sorts of mercenaries. In Burkina Faso, you know, the Wagner group that's involved in there, it's creating all sort of political chaos in that country. But to answer your question, Saudi Arabia is interested, definitely, because, again, they've got reserves and they've got money, and at some point they have to diversify their economy. And they're looking at stable African countries where they can invest their money. And I think South Africa is one of those countries. We know that they are looking at investing in the refineries in South Africa. In Mozambique, they've moved into also looking at opportunities there. They're also looking at the arable land because they need to secure their food supply henceforth, given that Saudi Arabia at the moment is not producing anything because it's a desert. So they're looking at opportunities, and South Africa, I think, will present those kind of opportunities. What
about Saudi's checkered human rights record? Because just recently there was a lot of criticism when Joe Biden himself traveled to Saudi, basically trying to persuade them not to cut oil production, which they've now done. People brought back the issue of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident, murdered at the Turkish embassy 2018, I think it was. The Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, not prosecuted, not directly linked, but people have said that is a cloud that hangs over the Saudi royal family. Could South Africa be tainted by that? Does it matter?
Well, I was hoping you were not going to ask me that. But yeah, Saudi Arabia's human rights record is checkered. Mohammed bin Salman is not indirectly, but directly implicated in the killing, chopping, and eventually dissolving the board of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 in Istanbul. So the Saudi, I mean, currently, you know, Saudi is jailing even the people who are participating in social media. We have people who are jailed for life, and some of them sentenced to death because they refuse to be evacuated from some of the places where Saudi is intending to build what is known as Newzroom City, which is the new city that they're building in the northeast of Saudi Arabia. So Saudis, particularly Mohammed bin Salman's human rights record, is nothing to be proud of. And I was surprised that South Africa, of course, did not think twice into going to visit Mohammed bin Salman, notwithstanding that Joe Biden preferred a fist bump instead of a handshake, because that would have communicated a different or sent a different message to the United States.
But it's a reminder, isn't it, that when push comes to shove, the governments of the world ultimately will make decisions that are best for them domestically versus going, for instance, with a human rights issue when they are not directly affected, as is in this case.
It's true, but at the same time, the interest of the country is by and large also dependent on relationship. You can't just willy-nilly and blindly have a relationship with murderers because you happened to look for investments. For some of us who believe that the foreign policy should reflect, number one, healthy and a positive human rights record to whoever it is that we want to be friends with, one would have expected South Africa would have looked at that, particularly the optics of it. Joe Biden, if you remember, one of the things he did, he avoided cameras, he avoided journalists to be with him during that GCC meeting in Saudi Arabia. He avoided a handshake. In fact, he insisted on a fist bump, and it was a 2-second fist bump when you don't know whatever happened inside there. And one would have expected that Cyril Ramaphosa, instead of being allowed to be ushered from the aeroplane into the holding place in the airport, would have avoided those kind of things. But
a low-key arrival.
Low-key arrival, and that was not the case. And I don't blame him, of course. I don't think that they really do care what had happened to Jamal Khashoggi, nor the human rights record of Saudi Arabia.
Thembisa, Fakude, good to speak to you, so thank you very much for coming in tonight.